They say you can tell the measure of a man not by how loud he speaks, but by how steady he stands when the world tries to push him down. Thomas Carter wasn't the kind of man who raised his voice. He never felt the need. At 72, with silver hair tucked beneath an old baseball cap and hands rough from decades of honest work, Thomas lived a quiet life on the edge of town. His land was small, nothing to boast about. A vegetable garden out back, a few chickens, a line of wildflowers running along the fence where the sun caught them just right in the early morning. And the fence, it wasn't pretty. Weathered wood, patched here and there, where the years had taken their toll. Some boards leaned, some bore the marks of time, but they stood, just like Thomas did. The neighbors whispered sometimes, said the fence was an eyesore, said it dragged down the value of the place. But Thomas, he kept his head down. He kept hammering where the nails had come loose, one steady swing at a time. Across the way, behind a row of sculpted hedges and a polished stone driveway, stood the Whitmore estate, big, white, shining, all flash and sharp edges. And at its heart, Rebecca Whitmore, mid-50s, heels clicking on tile, sunglasses always perched just so. She didn't much care for Thomas's fence, never had. Whenever she rolled by in her sleek silver SUV, she glanced toward that old line of boards and let out a soft, bitter laugh. "You'd think he'd tear that thing down by now," she said once, loud enough for Thomas to hear. "Brings down the whole block just looking at it." Thomas heard her. He always did. But he didn't answer. He just tipped the brim of his cap, pressed another nail into place, and kept working. Because Thomas Carter knew something Rebecca Whitmore didn't. He knew that fences, the real ones, aren't just wooden nails. They're the lines we draw to keep peace, to hold respect, to say, "This is mine, and you don't get to walk over it." But some people, they don't learn that lesson until it's too late. And Rebecca Whitmore, with all her money, all her flash, was about to find out the hard way. It started small. The first time, it was just a pile of clippings, trimmings from Rebecca Whitmore's sculpted hedges, dumped a little too close to the fence line. Neatly stacked, sure, but on Thomas Carter's side of the boundary. Thomas saw it the next morning as he made his usual walk around the property, feed bucket in hand. He stood there a moment, staring at the pile. Said nothing, just picked up the clippings and tossed them into the compost bin. Maybe it was a mistake, he told himself. Maybe the landscaping crew hadn't known where the line was. But the second time, it wasn't a mistake. It was grass clippings, mulch, scraps from Rebecca's latest garden project, dumped right up against the same stretch of fence. Not over the line by accident, over the line on purpose. Thomas didn't argue, he didn't yell. He just walked the fence again, made a quiet note of what he'd seen, and moved on. But Rebecca, she wasn't done. One Saturday afternoon, her gardeners pulled right up along the edge of Thomas's property, trailer full of young cypress trees in tow. They planted them tight against the fence, roots crowding the soil that didn't belong to her. Thomas waited until they'd packed up their tools and driven away. Then he walked over, slow, steady, like always, and knocked on her front door. She answered wearing a silk blouse, diamond studs in her ears, sunglasses pushed up on top of her head. "Ms. Whitmore," Thomas said, voice calm, "your crew planted on my side of the line." Rebecca smiled, tilted her head. "Oh, did they? I'm sure it was just a misunderstanding. But honestly, Mr. Carter, does it really matter? I mean, look at that fence." She waved one hand toward the weathered boards like she was swatting at flies. "That thing's falling apart. You should be grateful someone's adding a little beauty to your side of the yard." Thomas felt the words settle heavy in his chest, but his face stayed still. "It matters," he said quietly. Rebecca's smile sharpened. She crossed her arms, leaned one shoulder against the doorframe. "Well, maybe if you'd put a little effort into that fence, Mr. Carter, this wouldn't be an issue." She didn't wait for a reply, just turned and shut the door. The days passed. The cypress trees stayed, and Rebecca kept pushing. When she hosted one of her summer garden parties, cars lined both sides of the narrow street, music drifting loud and careless through the air. Her guests parked wherever they pleased, some right up against Thomas's fence. One white sedan rolled just close enough to crack a loose board when it backed out too fast. Thomas found the damage that evening. Bent wood, splintered edges, tire marks in the soft dirt where the car had skidded. No one came to apologize. He stood there a long time, looking at that broken board, one hand resting on the top rail. The next morning, he replaced the damaged slat. Same steady hands, same quiet patience. But this time, he wrote it down. The date, the time, what he'd seen. Because Thomas Carter had lived long enough to know some battles aren't worth the fight, but some need to be kept on record. It didn't stop with the trees. If anything, that was just the beginning. The next time Thomas Carter noticed trouble, it wasn't mulch or clippings. It was water. Late one afternoon, as the sun sagged low behind the hills, Thomas stood by the edge of his garden and watched a slow, steady stream of gray water snake its way through the fence line. Thin at first, then thicker, carrying the sour smell of soap and chemicals. He followed it uphill with his eyes, back to Rebecca Whitmore's sprawling back patio, where one of her hired men was power washing the stone tiles, blasting dirt and debris right toward Thomas's land. No accident this time. The man didn't even glance in Thomas's direction, just kept the hose aimed low, sending rinse water straight into Thomas's vegetable beds. Thomas knelt down, ran his fingers through the wet soil, watched the muddy water pool around the roots of his collard greens. The next morning, 2 of his chickens lay sick near the coop. One wouldn't stand. Thomas didn't yell, didn't march up to the Whitmore house. He took a picture, then he took another. The water line at the fence, the soft earth pushed back by the runoff, the wilted plants. Rebecca's words echoed in his mind. Does it really matter? It mattered now. But Rebecca didn't see it that way. When Thomas finally came to her door again, photos in hand, calm as ever, she barely let him finish his first sentence. "Oh, please," she snapped, waving her hand like she was brushing away a bad smell. "If you're going to blame me for your sick chickens, Mr. Carter, you'd better have a lot more than pictures of wet dirt." Thomas held her gaze, steady, quiet. "The runoff's coming from your property," he said. "Every time you wash that patio, it floods my garden. It's killing my plants." Rebecca gave a soft, humorless laugh. "It's not my problem if your little hobby farm can't handle a little water." Then she leaned in, voice dropping low, eyes hard behind her designer shades. "And if I were you, I'd be careful about making accusations you can't prove." She closed the door, not with a slam, just a sharp click. Thomas stood there for a long moment on her porch, listening to the sound of the breeze moving through the cypress trees she'd planted too close to the line. He could feel the burn of anger rise in his chest. But anger wasn't the way. Thomas Carter had never been a man for shouting, never needed to be. Instead, he walked home, sat down at his kitchen table, opened the old spiral notebook he kept by the window, and wrote the date, the time, the details. Then he turned to a fresh page, titled it in big, careful letters, Fence Incident Report. He didn't know how this would end, not yet, but Thomas Carter had a lifetime's worth of patience, and something told him this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Thomas Carter knew the rains would come. Maybe not this week, maybe not the next. But sooner or later, they always did. It was the way of things in that part of the country. Long, dry summers followed by heavy autumn storms. The kind of rain that didn't just soak the ground. The kind that poured down hard and fast, filling the ditches, turning the soft earth into rivers. Thomas had lived on that land long enough to know how the water moved, where it gathered, where it needed to go. And he knew, better than anyone, that the fence she mocked so easily wasn't just for show. It wasn't just boards and nails. It was a barrier, a guide, the line that kept the runoff at bay when the storms rolled in from the west. But Rebecca Whitmore, she didn't know that, or maybe she didn't care. When her men tore down that section of the fence to plant their precious trees, they hadn't just crossed a property line. They'd pulled down the only thing standing between her backyard and the floodplain that had run through that part of the valley for generations. Thomas had rebuilt what he could, but only on his side. The breach remained, and Rebecca, with all her landscaping and luxury, had no idea what she'd done. So Thomas waited. He watched the skies, listened to the weather reports on the old radio that sat by his kitchen window, marked the patterns, tracked the clouds as they gathered over the ridge. But he didn't just sit and hope. He prepared. Every day he added a little more to the notebook. Dates, times, photos printed out from the cheap color printer down at the library, snapshots of the broken fence, the planted trees crowding the line, the streams of wash water cutting through his soil. Each page carefully labeled, organized, neat. There were receipts too, copies of the local zoning laws tucked into the back of the binder, sections highlighted, notes scribbled in the margins, unauthorized alteration of boundary structures, liability for property damage due to water displacement, responsibility of landowners to manage runoff onto adjacent lots. Thomas didn't rush, didn't push. He knew that people like Rebecca Whitmore counted on others to give up, to lose patience, to wear down. But Thomas Carter had never been in a hurry. Instead, he spent his mornings walking the property line, camera in hand, documenting every new change. The trees growing taller, their roots pushing deeper, the slope of the ground shifting subtly where the workers had graded the soil without a permit. And at night he read, not novels, not the newspaper, municipal codes, drainage regulations, old survey maps that showed the natural water flow through the valley before the houses came, before the roads carved up the land. Thomas even drove down to the county office one Tuesday afternoon, hat in hand, and asked the clerk for copies of the original land plats. The young woman behind the desk barely looked up. "No one's asked for those in years," she'd said. "I'm not most folks," Thomas replied, gentle but firm. He brought the maps home, spread them out across the kitchen table, marked the lines where the water should have gone and where it would go now, with the fence broken and the soil disturbed. He spoke to a friend from church who worked as a local contractor, asked quiet questions about erosion, about runoff, about whose name went on the permits for outdoor work like the kind Rebecca's crew had done. The answers lined up exactly the way Thomas expected they would. No permits, no inspections, no thought to the way water moves when it's given an easy path downhill. And still, he said nothing. When Rebecca passed by in her SUV, Thomas gave her the same small nod he always had. No smile, no wave, just that quiet acknowledgement. Because some lessons, he knew, don't stick when you tell them out loud. Some lessons, you have to let the world teach. And the world, with its turning seasons and heavy skies, was getting ready. The forecast called for storms, the kind that rolled in fast and stayed longer than they were welcome. Thomas felt the first warning on the wind one afternoon as he stood on the porch, watching the clouds pile up thick and gray along the horizon. The air was heavy, close against the skin, the smell of rain already there, carried on the breeze like a promise. He leaned against the railing, one hand resting lightly on the notebook beside him. It wasn't anger that filled him. It wasn't revenge. It was certainty. He knew how this worked. He'd seen it before. When the ground couldn't hold back the water, it found its own way. And Rebecca Whitmore's picture-perfect backyard, the one she'd paved and polished and paraded in front of the neighbors, sat square in the path of the floodplain she had helped open wide. Thomas looked up at the sky. The clouds were moving faster now, darker. He turned, went back inside, and closed the door behind him. Then he waited. The rain came just after midnight. At first it was gentle, a soft tapping on the roof of Thomas Carter's porch, the kind of rain that settles the dust and makes the earth smell sweet. But Thomas knew better than to trust the softness of a first drizzle. He was already awake when the wind picked up. Outside, the clouds had thickened into a wall of black. Lightning stitched jagged lines across the sky, followed by the slow, rolling growl of thunder moving closer with each breath. By 2 a.m., the rain was no longer gentle. It hammered the tin roof, drummed against the windows, filled the gutters so fast the water spilled over the sides in sheets. Thomas sat at his kitchen table, the notebook open in front of him, a single lamp casting a soft yellow circle of light across the page. He didn't write. Not tonight. There was nothing left to record. Everything that needed saying would be written by the rain. Across the way at the Whitmore estate, the party lights were still strung across the back patio, little white bulbs swaying in the storm. The music had long since stopped, the laughter gone quiet hours ago. But the evidence of the last gathering remained. Half-empty wine glasses on the stone ledge, silver chairs stacked carelessly near the open gate, puddles already forming along the seams of the patio. Rebecca Whitmore slept upstairs, behind thick walls and blackout curtains, unaware of the gathering storm outside her polished windows. By 3 a.m., the rain had turned the ground to soup. The runoff began the same way it always did, sliding down the slope, following the easiest path, searching for low ground. It should have hit the fence, but there was no fence there to stop it anymore. The water pooled for a moment at the gap where Rebecca's crew had ripped the boards out months before. Then it poured through, fast and hungry, rolling down into her backyard like a slow-rising tide. It filled the lower garden first, the neat rows of imported flowers, the marble bird bath, the ornamental shrubs. Water rushed over them all, drowning roots, toppling the delicate planters. The cypress trees, young and unprepared, leaned hard into the wind as the soil at their bases washed away. The patio flooded next. Water crept across the carefully laid stone tiles, soaking the expensive outdoor cushions, knocking over the glass lanterns that lined the walkway. The runoff carried bits of mulch and trash, swirling it together into a dark slurry that coated everything in its path. And the basement, the pride of the Whitmore estate, where wine racks stood tall against the stone walls, where storage boxes sat stacked neatly along the floor, took the brunt of it. The water found the stairs. It always does. By the time Rebecca woke to the sound of the sump pump alarm screaming from below, the damage had already begun. She rushed down the stairs barefoot, silk robe clutched tight at her chest, only to stop dead at the sight of the basement floor under 2 inches of dirty rising water. The boxes at the far wall had tipped sideways, their contents spilling out into the flood. The wine racks sagged under the weight, bottles clinking against one another as the water rose higher. "Oh my God," she gasped, fumbling for her phone. Outside, the rain showed no signs of stopping. By dawn, the entire backyard was a shallow lake. The reflection of the gray morning sky shimmered on the surface of the floodwater. Bits of garden debris floated like forgotten toys across the drowned patio. Thomas stood on his porch, watching the water swell and move. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. Just leaned against the railing, arms crossed loosely over his chest, eyes steady on the damage unfolding across the way. He could hear the shouts as Rebecca's groundskeeper waded through the water, shouting into his phone, barking orders at the cleanup crew. The whine of wet vacs started up not long after, the frantic scraping of shovels as they tried to clear the worst of the mud before the next round of rain hit. But the thing about water is, once it finds its way through, it remembers. You can't unmake the path. Rebecca came out onto her back patio later that afternoon, wrapped in a raincoat, boots sunk deep into the mud where the garden had been. She turned, scanning the yard, her eyes falling on the broken line of the fence, the missing boards, the place where the runoff had poured through like a river. And for the first time, she looked toward Thomas's house. Their eyes met across the waterlogged yards. Thomas didn't wave, didn't nod this time. He just stood there, quiet as ever, steady as the fence she'd torn down. The line between them had been clear. She was the one who'd chosen to cross it, and now the flood had taught the rest. The rains didn't last forever. By the end of the week, the skies cleared, leaving behind soft blue mornings and the smell of wet earth. The standing water in Rebecca Whitmore's yard began to recede, slow and steady, pulling back the mess it had made, but not the damage. The basement was ruined, the wine racks gone, the lower garden stripped bare down to the roots, and the fence still broken. Rebecca stayed indoors most days after that. The landscapers came and went, their trucks parked farther down the street now, as if they knew better than to block the Carter place again. For the first time in a long while, there were no parties at the Whitmore house, no music drifting over the hedges, no laughter, just the quiet. It was a different kind of silence than before, not the smug, dismissive kind, but the silence of someone who had been humbled. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after the flood, Thomas Carter was out by the fence again, hammer in hand. Another loose board, another patch to be made. Same work he'd always done. Slow, steady. He didn't hear her approach, but when he turned, there she was. Rebecca Whitmore, standing just on her side of the line. No sunglasses this time, no silk scarf, just a plain jacket zipped up against the wind, hands tucked into the pockets. She didn't speak right away. For a moment they just stood there, the ruined backyard behind her, the mended fence between them. Then she cleared her throat. Software hesitant. I didn't understand, she said, about the fence, about why it mattered. Her eyes dropped to the ground. I understand now. Thomas didn't answer right away. He set the hammer down on the post beside him, wiped his hands on the front of his jeans. Some things, he said quietly, you can tell folks 100 times, they won't hear it. He nodded once toward the muddy slope behind her. But the land, the water, they have a way of teaching it for you. Rebecca swallowed hard. She met his eyes again, and this time there was no fight in them, only the weight of someone who'd learned the hard way. I'm sorry, Mr. Carter, she said, for the trouble I caused, for not listening. Thomas gave a slow nod. Fix the fence, he said, voice steady. Properly this time. She nodded back. I will. Then she turned and walked away. Thomas watched her go, the wind tugging gently at the hem of her coat, the last of the puddles reflecting the soft gold of the setting sun. He picked up the hammer again, went back to work. Because dignity, he knew, wasn't something you had to shout about. It wasn't loud, it wasn't cruel. It was steady, quiet, like the fence that stood its ground. And sometimes, that's all it takes to remind the world where the line is drawn. Respect doesn't always come easy, but it always starts with knowing where to stand and refusing to be moved. At Narrated Stories, we believe the most powerful lessons often come not from loud victories, but from quiet strength. Stories like this one remind us that dignity, respect, and patience are not just words. They are choices we make every day, especially when the world challenges our boundaries. In this emotional story, we witnessed how one man, an older black man, a farmer, a neighbor, chose not to fight back with anger, but with steady hands and quiet resolve. His strength wasn't in how loud he spoke, but in how firmly he stood his ground. These are the kinds of emotional stories we tell here at Unraveled Fates. Stories that don't always shout, but stay with you. Stories that reflect the struggles and grace of everyday people who deserve to be seen, to be heard, to be respected. If this story moved you, if it made you pause and reflect on your own life, your own neighbors, your own quiet battles, we invite you to share it. Maybe you know someone who needs to hear this today. Maybe you have your own story about standing your ground, about the fight for respect that doesn't require raised voices. Leave us a comment below. Tell us what part of this story stayed with you. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, true tales of dignity, resilience, and quiet justice, don't forget to subscribe and join us here at Narrated Stories, where every voice matters. Because sometimes, the strongest stand doesn't make a sound.